Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Rahul Gandhi has accused the BJP of the politics of revenge. Does the cancellation of a mega food park in Amethi justify the use of such strong emotional language? Or is the BJP, whilst targeting Rahul, actually punishing poor farmers who need government help? That's the debate in part 2. But first, in 6 days' time, the Modi government will mark its first anniversary in office. Many believe its greatest challenge was the economy, so in part 1 we ask, how has it acquitted itself? Where has it succeeded and where has it proved inadequate? Joining me now to talk about the Modi government's economic performance is the former president of CII and vice chairman of Ashok Leyland, R. Sheshasai, former chief economic advisor Arvind Virmani, former CEO, author and columnist Gurcharan Das, and the South Asia Chief of Bureau of the Financial Times, Victor Mallet. Mr. Sheshasai, let me start with a simple question. As one of India's leading industrialists and as a former chairman of CII, what's your assessment of the Modi government's handling of the economy during its first year in office?
I think it's set the compass at the right direction. It's moved very fast in terms of declogging the decision-making process. I would in particular talk about the way that the Power and Coal Ministry has dealt with the various issues which had stalled the projects. The Environment Ministry, there are no complaints about it. At the policy level, which is slightly a higher level than just doing the routine decision-making, at a policy level, perhaps it's taken the steps in the right direction. One could argue that they are not adequate steps, for example, in terms of FDI and defense. Maybe we could argue that it should have gone farther than the 49% to be effective on the ground. But the direction has been right. At another level, at the legislative level, which of course is a minefield, we all know that this is not going to be an easy travel, and obviously there have been a lot of challenges, but steadfastly it's been moving in the right direction. But the most important thing is the fact that today there is a much greater degree of confidence about the future. India is back on the high table globally, and I think there is a very, very large sense of the feel-good factor. So in all, I would say, very good direction.
All right, you've raised many important issues there. I'll try and come to all of them one by one. Gurcharan Das, in February, Deepak Parekh told PTI that nothing had changed on the ground and impatience, as he put it, was creeping in because changes weren't happening. And at the time, many industrialists agreed with him. Today, 3 months later, is the situation unchanged as far as ease of doing business is concerned, or have things improved?
Well, there are a number of areas where the ease of business has improved. And for example, there are half the number of forms required for export-import. Maharashtra government has cut half the approvals required for starting a business. And in this way, a number of states, Andhra and Telangana, are really the best in class for creating the best environment. And this competitiveness is now going to come to a head at the end of August, when the results of a big study are announced on the ease of doing business state by state by Modi with all the chief ministers to really say which are the best states. Now this is good. But I do believe that Mr. Modi himself can do a lot more, in the sense that instead of just delegating it to Amitabh Kant's group, a leader has to get into the messy details of implementation, and he has not done that. If he had done that, I think half the BJP states today would be far better places for doing business.
Okay.
And that very often takes a phone call on his part.
And that is a phone call clearly
that
he
I
hasn't
think
made.
is a deficit.
Arvind Virmani, Mr.
No,
Jaitley,
he hasn't made.
Mr. Jaitley, Arvind Virmani, proudly points to the fact that the fiscal deficit, inflation and CAD are sharply down. He also talks about how growth has gone up, but let's leave growth aside. because growth is a problematic figure now that they've changed the way they calculate it. But what hasn't happened, and people keep referring to this, is investment. Industrialists still shy away from putting their money into new ventures. They're still waiting for something more. Why is investment lagging behind?
Well, actually, growth and investment are picking up. You see, there are basically three factors. One is the consumer growth, which is increasing. It's gone from something like 3 to 5 to 7% growth. The investment, the fixed investment, which is the key driver of growth, has gone from something like 0 to 3% to 5%. Now, the problem which you are referring to is really that corporate investment and corporate growth has not picked up.
And why?
And one of the reasons is that people didn't see the extent of the damage done by the global crisis, really. So, in fact, I've written a number of papers, one of them should be coming out soon, which show that really the globalized sectors of the economy were affected much more and continue to be affected by the lack of global demand and capacity. That doesn't mean we can't do anything about it. But
are you also therefore suggesting that it's wrong to blame Mr. Modi for the fact that corporate investment hasn't picked up?
Well,
this is an international problem which needs more time.
Yes and no, because we take credit for, or we say that they are taking credit for the inflation fall, the commodity price, but then you go to balance it, there were negative factors too. On net, they have gained from the external sector, but we shouldn't forget this negative.
Now, Victor Mallet, Mr. Modi and Mr. Jaitley are hoping for very sharply stepped up foreign investment. The first impediment was the retrospective taxation problem. Companies like Vodafone are a great example that they inherited, but they failed to reverse. All Mr. Jaitley has done is promise not to do it again. Then, recently, they seem to have added the MAT problem, which now, somewhat belatedly, the government hopes to settle through the Justice Shah Committee. Taken together, has this sent out a confusing message to foreign investors? Has it in fact deterred investment, or has it had no impact, as Mr. Jaitley insists?
No, I think it's definitely been a deterrent. I mean, to be fair, the government, I think, now acknowledges that it didn't handle it very well. You hear a lot of senior government officials saying this is something we messed up. And I think the problem was that they said we're not going to do it again, but they weren't able to clear up the mess of the retrospective taxation and indeed the MAT, the minimum tax that affects institutional investors. So they were left with these legacy issues. They were legacy issues, but they could have handled them better. They could have cleared the decks essentially by telling officials in the tax department what to do and what not to do. And they were a bit feeble about that at the beginning. And they sort of said, well, there's nothing we can do. These things are already in process. And the result was some very confusing messages to investors of all kinds. And of course, this also affects Indian investors. Although the prominent targets are foreign investors, Indian companies and Indian entrepreneurs are equally horrified by unpredictable taxation and unpredictable tax demands that they're getting all the time from the tax authorities. So that is a bad thing. They are trying to clear it up.
Okay.
And we don't quite yet know what the terms of reference of this committee are, so we're not quite sure how far they can go in clearing the decks and saying, okay, we're going to start now from a new beginning and get on with investing.
Mr. Shesasai, on this issue of retrospective taxation as well as the more recent issue of MAT, the Wall Street Journal, one of the world's most influential financial papers, other than, of course, Victor Mallet's Financial Times, in an editorial on the 3rd of May, actually said that Mr. Modi should either bring Arun Jaitley into line or replace him. Is that an unfair comment? Or would you actually agree with Victor Mallet that this is a critical issue that affects foreign investors and Indian investors, and it should have been better handled, and it was handled not just poorly, but it was handled without realizing the consequences of what was being done?
I think the strategic intent on this issue has been clear and unambiguous. More than once, both the finance minister and indeed even the Prime Minister have articulated this fact that they have to get the tax regime to be more investor friendly, and they have to have a competitive tax regime in this country in order to attract investments. And that is something which nobody doubts. But for sure, in the execution, there could have been more efficient execution. And to the extent that they have tripped on this, it certainly is a setback, but not an irretrievable setback. So long as the intent is right, I think the people will realize that the execution issues can be taken care of. And we are just now in the process of getting this done. And so we need a little patience on this. But I think the lessons have been learned. I don't think I would see another recurrence of this issue again.
Kuchaldas, let's come to some of the critical reforms that the government at the moment seems to be having trouble getting through Parliament. Let's start with land acquisition. There's no doubt that this is a critical set of amendments that probably every industrialist and most economists would agree on. But given that the government knew it didn't have a majority in the Rajya Sabha, should it have actually made a greater effort to reach out to the opposition and perhaps to its own allies before pushing through an ordinance? In other words, what I'm really asking is, when we talk of land acquisition, is this a good reform facing obstacles because it's been politically poorly handled?
Well, it is a good reform. It's basically trying to cut red tape. It's not going to affect the farmer in any significant way. In fact, it's going to improve the life of the farmer, because even the farmer's son wants jobs, and when it's executed, it will be a great boon for the country. Yes, I think this is another example of poor follow-up, poor follow-through, as I mentioned in the case of ease of doing business just now, and as it's been referenced in the case of the tax. I think where Mr. Modi needs to pay more attention is in follow-up, is in implementation, is in the process of getting, as I said, into the messy details and trying to build bridges with the opposition, at the same time making sure that his implementers, he has to monitor this very closely, or he has to have key people monitoring it. He seems to not be completely, we gave him credit for his great legendary implementation skills, and we have to see those skills so far.
What you're saying, therefore, is that as far as those implementation skills are concerned, they have not been visibly displayed in Delhi after he took over as Prime Minister.
I think that would be correct. That would be the disappointment that somebody like me feels, because I was one of the first liberals who endorsed Mr. Modi, and I would have expected a much greater sense of the pulse of the implementation executional process than I have seen so far.
One quick question before I go to Mr. Virmani. How disappointing is this? On a scale of very disappointing, mildly disappointing, which would it be?
No, I would say it's not terrible, not very disappointing, because I know he has the capacity to turn around very fast. That's what he has shown. He has shown a tremendous flexibility about moving things. He's not the rigid sort of leader we thought he was.
But he needs clearly here to make amends and impress people like you, because here he has disappointed. Let me come to GST, Mr. Virmani, which is in fact the big reform the government wants to push through. They've clearly stumbled in Parliament. The bill hasn't happened. And it's now possible that they may end up missing the April 1, 2016 deadline, unless they can ensure that the states pass the constitutional amendment rapidly. But here, how much of the fault and the problem lies in the government's faulty handling of Parliament, and how much of the blame lies with Congress's opportunistic position on a bill that they actually had initiated?
Yeah, this is quite right. I don't want to go into the earlier issue which I could comment on, but it's quite different from the land issue. And the reason is that it was an opportunistic in the sense that there was some CAG report or something referring to one of the ministers, and that was taken up to stall this. It had nothing to do with the bill itself.
Although Congress does claim that there are 8 issues where they want clarification, which is why they've sent it to a committee yet again.
Well, from what I read in the papers, I don't have any inside information. I think it was purely opportunistic in the sense that I'm saying, because earlier indications from reports in the papers was that directly or indirectly the Congress would go along.
Now, Victor Mallet, the government has got a lot of praise for the focus it's put on Make in India, but many people say that the essential reforms necessary to facilitate Make in India, for example, labour reforms, were either initially left to the states like Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. Now, fairly recently, the Labour Ministry has put a draft of possible reforms on its website, but that's about it. Is this a measure where, for instance, labour reforms I'm talking about, the government could achieve more if it had acted early when it was riding high? Or do you accept Arun Jaitley's argument that reform is the art of the possible and the difficult measures can't be tackled immediately, and we need to be more understanding about the failure to deliver swiftly on labour reform?
I think the government's policy on this has been to devolve it to the states and to talk about competitive federalism. So they're saying that labour reforms are something that can be introduced as they have been introduced in Rajasthan and in Madhya Pradesh, and that if this works, other states will want to follow suit. And that seems to me, in this case, to be quite a sensible policy. The bigger issue with Make in India is not that it's not a good idea. It clearly is a good idea to improve the Indian economy and to make India part of the global supply chains. But because of the way manufacturing has changed dramatically around the world and become much more automated, it's just going to be very, very hard to have the Make in India policy create the millions and millions and hundreds of millions of jobs that India needs in the next decade or so. And that is, I think, the biggest challenge for this government and future governments,
can I interrupt?
Creating those jobs.
You're making a much bigger, important criticism. You're saying that the belief that Make in India could be the panacea for the employment necessity that Mr. Modi faces and the millions of jobs that he needs to create, that conceptual belief is itself mistaken because of the nature of manufacturing that has changed and become a lot more mechanized and a lot less labor driven.
Well, I'd put it a slightly different way. I'd say that Make in India is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So there are going to have to be other ways of creating jobs. I mean, clearly it helps, and you will get ancillary jobs around the factories. I was talking the other day about how the new Ford factory in Gujarat, which was opened by John Kerry, he was looking out over the factory, and it was basically a bunch of Kawasaki robots and very few workers. But industrialists make the point that that factory will need parts, and those parts can be made locally. The factory workers will need services, and so on. So it's not a bad idea. It's just that it can't achieve one of its key goals, which is to create all the jobs that India needs. So those jobs are going to have to come from somewhere else, which essentially means services.
Mr. Sheshasai, let me sum up this part of our discussion by asking you whether you think the government in this first year has done enough to put the country on a sustained path of 8% growth, rising, as Mr. Jaitley often says, rapidly to 10% growth. Earlier, you pointed out that, for instance, raising FDI and defense to 49 might turn out to be insufficient and too little to attract investment. Do you think many of the other things they've done, as far as pushing the country to an 8% trajectory, may also turn out to be insufficient and inadequate?
I would say the answer is clearly yes, they have done enough, but I want to also point out that we can't talk about the 8% growth in India in absolute terms. We got to do that relative to the global economic situation. The fact is that India can look at this growth only on the basis of an investment-led growth pattern. And the global situation is that there is not much money going into capital formation in job-creating kind of industries anyway. There is overcapacity in all commodities. There is overcapacity on manufactured goods like automobiles and electronic goods. So the only investment that's going in is in technology. When I say only investment, substantial investment is going in technology. And therefore, in some sense, it's going to be difficult to get investment cycle to kickstart the economy or to take it to 8% or a double-digit growth in India in isolation of this global phenomenon. But that having been said, I certainly think that what has been done so far is in the right direction. Now we have to wait for all the fruits of what have been done to kick in, and I do hope that by then the environment changes a little more favorably at a global level.
Kurucharandas, as the government enters its second year, and bearing in mind that it still has 4 more to go, where do you think it really needs now to focus attention and concentrate its efforts?
I think it's really the same theme, Karan. It's really to do with execution. There are some very good plans in place, and they're moving ahead, but just a little more attention to the details, to the messy details, will make all the difference. Take Swachh Bharat. Now, Swachh Bharat can become a very powerful idea if the Swachh mission worked with municipalities, made a few model successes of municipalities so that others could see how you could make it work. And these are matters of implementation and details. And this is not hard to do, because I think the general direction and the overall determination and the positivism is there. And therefore, I personally think as we move into the second year, one can be optimistic.
Okay. Mr. Bilmani,
Yeah.
let me put this to you. There's a lot of concern about the focus, or some people actually say lack of focus, on social sector issues like health, education, and a whole range of things to do with women and childcare development. Now, the government says that its reduced funding will be more than made up by what the states will be putting in, because the states have got a 10% jump in tax revenues. Do you accept that argument, and are you satisfied by it, or do you think the critics are right to be concerned?
I disagree with the critics, but let me make 2 related points which I think are very important.
Answer this and then go back to the others. Answer this first.
Okay. So, the question is, you have to be very clear. Do you believe in federalism? Do you believe in the federalism in the constitution? The whole point of abolishing the planning commission was it set up a parallel structure where the central government kept making new schemes. I heard many complaints. I was there for half my career, and people always used to complain in every sector, health, education. They said, we have a system, we have an education system, we have a health system, and you come and you make these new schemes. We have to hire new people for these schemes. They are not integrated with the old ones. It's heavily wasteful. Now, if you believe that, you can't now suddenly turn around and go the other way.
Okay.
So I agree with the recommendations of the Finance Commission. I think it should be completely decentralized. That's the whole idea of subsidiarity. That's the whole idea of Panchayati Raj, that the things which public goods which should be delivered at the bottom level should be delivered there, not from the top.
You wanted to make 2 other points. Make them quickly.
Okay, very quickly. They are both related. One is that there's a 2-pronged approach to labor. One is decentralization of state, but it's also to ease business, using technology, simplifying, etc. That is going on, under 40, and that relates to MSMs. And this is where the second point comes in. It's not just the large companies. We are talking only about large companies. I'm surprised that Mr. Mallet also is only talking about large automobile companies. What I am talking about, what we are talking about, is the missing middle. Because of labor laws, the small scale used to get stuck. There's a little small tiny sector which is not productive. Then there is a large scale sector. There's no middle. And that's why labor laws are going to be very important and very good for the country if they are modified.
If they are modified,
yes,
but are they being modified with the speed with which is necessary? That's the question.
The speed, as we said, the 2-pronged approach means that certain things will be done at the center and some will be done by the state.
And this is something Mr. Modi is letting the states do rather than biting himself.
Competitive federalism.
Vikram Mallet, very quickly on something that in fact the Modi government is rather proud of. They say that the last government left under a cloud of scandal and scam. And there's no doubt about it, even if the government claims that they weren't the cause of the problem. In the first year of the Modi government, there is hardly any taint of scandal and scam. How appealing is that to foreign investors when they look at India?
I would say it's very appealing, but it's not, again, it's not only appealing to foreigners, it's very appealing to Indians. I've spoken to several heads of Indian conglomerates, big Indian tycoons, who've said one of the most remarkable things about the new government is that they no longer have to go to Delhi to beg and to sort of lobby ministers in their offices, and they're really delighted about that if they're honest businessmen, which some of them are, and they're saying, this is a great time wasting and a difficult process of essentially lobbying and corruption has been abolished at the very top. They're not saying that that's happened all the way down the system, but they're very pleased that it's happened at the top. And I think foreign investors who've always been much more constrained in being able to take part in corruption are also delighted, because it puts everybody on a much more even competitive playing field.
All right, gentlemen, let's leave it there. We will spend many more episodes between now and the 26th on Mr. Modi and that first tip, because clearly how we view this government is critical to our understanding and assessment of it. My thanks to my four guests for joining me.